Baruch atah
Baruch atah Adonai
melech
מלך
haolam
העולם,
אשר קידשנו
קידשנו
במצוותיו
במצוותיו,
וזמן
ציווה
וזרעי
Torah.
Praise to you, Lord our God, rule the universe, who has made us play with your commandments and command us to busy ourselves with the words of Torah. Gary, would you read our 4 children on 1 foot, please?
There's a, no, okay, there we go. 4 children on 1 foot. In the Megid section of the Passover Seder, we read about 4 children, 1 wise, 1 wicked, 1 simple, and 1 who does not know how to ask. Sometimes these are referred to as the 4 sons, but the Hebrew word banim could mean sons or children, and there is no need to exclude half of the Jewish people.
Thank you. So now that we know what we are talking about this evening, let's dive into it. Jesse, would you read our first text, please?
Sure. Blessed be the place of all. Blessed be God. Blessed be the one who gave the Torah to God's people Israel. Blessed be God. Corresponding to 4 children that the Torah speak, 1 who is wise, 1 who is evil, 1 who is innocent, and 1 who doesn't know to ask. The context. This is from the Passover Haggdah in the Magid section. It comes after Manish Tanah, which is based on the Mishnah, saying that if your child asks why this night is different, then you should tell them. And if they don't know how to ask, then you should teach them to say the Manish Tanah. Mishnah Pesachim 4. And then after the Haggdah says that it is praiseworthy to talk about the Exodus from Egypt. Exodus. Where did it go? It should be noted that the Pirkei Avot 3:14 refers to the Jews as children of the place, not that it says others aren't also God's children. The author of the Haggdah may have had that in mind when crafting this section. Additionally, the biblical book of Proverbs says that one should teach a child according to their way, 22:6. And this may have been consciously or subconsciously on the mind of the author of the part of the Haggdah or its source text. Similarly, the Mishnah says that according to the abilities of the child, do you teach them about the Exodus? Pesachim 10:4. Because there are 4 times that the Torah says that you should tell your child about Passover, the rabbis assumed that this must be 4 different types of children who are getting 4 different answers. Otherwise, the Torah could have said this once and been done with it. We know that children are different. If you were to say there are 4 types of children, which 4 would you choose?
Thank you. So we're not based off of the situation as it is, but we were to say, okay, the Torah says 4 times you should tell your children about Passover. So therefore, it must be that there are 4 different types of children. Okay, so what would those 4 different types of children be? Or what could
they don't really have a choice in the children that we get by natural childbirth. I'd say we love them all, no matter what their types were.
Okay.
So, David, is the question, what are 4 different kinds of children?
Yes, if you were to come up with the 4, if you were to come up with your own paradigm, what would it be?
Well, you've got children who learn. I mean, there are different ways that children learn. There's, right, they learn by doing, they learn by memorizing, and each child has, their preferred way of learning.
Gardner
And I know
says
there are, go ahead.
I was just going to say, the Gardner says there are 7 different types of children and they all have their gifts. So you have to go with what, I guess, you have to assume they each have a gift, look for that gift and work with that. Help to promote. Some are better at numbers, some are better at reading, some are better at manual dexterity, some are better at gross motor skills. So it's an odd question.
I was going to add, I picked my kids up from school today, so I've just been with them. Anyway, so I was going to add that some are imaginative and can do anything with a piece of tape. Some are inquisitive. There's always one who's serious. And then there's always a rule follower, the one that follows all the rules. But my kindergartner, there isn't anything on the ground that doesn't interest him. And when I pick anyway, he has to carry the stick until we get to the car. Today it was the parts of a pine tree. Get home to my house and I have to clean out the car all the time. Anyway. And he can never have too much tape.
Why do we have to make it only 4 types of children when there are so many vastly different personalities? Why is it just because the Torah says 4 times that you should tell your child about Passover? Why do we only have to pick 4 types of children?
Only at Passover, Carol.
I think that may have been the quandary that the people who wrote the Haggdah or whoever was behind it, what types of questions do we want answered, or how do we want to explain things, because there's different levels of intellect or interest that everybody's pointed out. So if we're having a difficult task, I would think that whoever posed the questions originally had that same type of difficulty. How do I express? Are these the things I want to express? How do I answer them? So different people are participating in the Seder, and maybe due to age or level of study or something of that nature. And so if we're having trouble, I would imagine they as well had that challenge until they finally came to the conclusion that it would be the 4 sons or the 4 people had different attitudes or intellectual ability to ask the questions.
If we have 4 children at the Seder and we have 2 different Seders, first and second night, we may get 8 different questions being asked, not just 4.
Well, maybe if you have, well, I mean, but I'm only commenting on what, based on what the final product is that we're discussing. But you're right, then it could be much more complicated.
Perhaps the way by labeling them in some way, which I don't like, we would teach them in different ways. Explain to them the Passover story in a way that each one would understand. I'm not sure what they mean by an evil child. I mean, there's difficult kids, but I don't like the word evil applied to children. So how would you strap him to the chair and say, well, I'm going to teach you about Passover. You know, I mean, I don't know.
Perhaps the description of 4 different children are actually more so referring to 4 different communication styles. The reason why I would maybe say that that's what's going on here is because there's a connection between different kinds of attributes associated with the child. So for example, a wicked child, a simple child, a wise child, the one who doesn't know how to ask. So what I would think maybe is going on here is that these are actually sort of, maybe they're sort of referring to the 4 different ways you can communicate to a child what's going on here, like in the actual Exodus story. So you would teach them maybe according to what would get them to learn best, maybe based on like how they are as a person. That's what I was thinking.
Well, are they really children? I'm thinking about this. Does it really have to be children if you'd have the other translation? Because just different people, there's one person who says, what does this mean to you? He's excluding himself. There's someone who is too simple to ask a question that has nothing to do with age. Think about it as well. Someone who has curiosity. I'm just wondering if just have the children do it so they feel that they're participants in the service to keep them interested.
That's an interesting idea, though, that maybe also it's a veiled way of communicating to adults as well.
Mm-hmm.
Charles, when my father passed away, my grandmother said, you know, doesn't matter how old they are, they're always your children. So I think you're right that, you know, this could just as easily apply to an adult of whatever age as it does to a child.
Well, you know, talking about that, my eldest daughter says that she has 3 boys in the house, her 2 sons and her husband.
Uh-huh.
So come to think of it, my youngest daughter says the same thing.
Well, when we would go to my Howard's brother's house, they have 4 sons. And when they would assign parts, it was really interesting because they would assign them according to what kind of a kid they were. And my brother-in-law would tell them to read that son's part based on who they were. Now, one wasn't evil, but he was kind of a troublemaker, so he got that part.
That sounds like one of my grandsons. And then his brother is one of the persons who's always asking questions and wants to know more. But they're both sharp, but they're just one of them's very mischievous.
Yeah,
no?
I have one of those.
Who knows? Maybe the rabbis, whoever developed this, had observed different children.
Yeah.
All right. So a quick note about the text that we read. You guys all have great thoughts about this. The text is called Baruch HaMakom in Hebrew because the first 2 words are Baruch HaMakom. The most common tune is Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu, Baruch Shenatan Torah Lemo Yisrael, Baruch HaMakom Baruch Hu. And then it goes on from there. And I have a recording of that on the source sheet at this point. And that tune was composed by Reuven Königsberg in 1971 for a particular album by the Nagino Orchestra. And if you're interested in that tune and in that particular snippet of the Haggdah, there is another YouTube video with a link that you can click on as we go further. So with that, we're going to move on to step 1 in the story of the 4 children. the biblical source texts. Carol, would you read our first text, please? Carol Koenig.
I'm muted. Okay, sorry. And when you enter the land that Adonai will give you as promised, you shall observe this rite. And when your children ask you, what do you mean by this rite? You shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice to Adonai, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when smiting the Egyptians, but saved our houses. Those assembled then bowed low in homage. Context. This is from the biblical book of Exodus, right after the instructions are given for the first Passover, painting the doorposts with blood and such, and right before the death of the firstborn plague actually happens. Which child would you associate with this verse? Wise, wicked, simple, or doesn't know how to ask?
Thank you.
I think that it might apply to the quote unquote wicked child, perhaps, because it uses language of punishment. So, for example, verse 27, you shall say it is the Passover sacrifice to Hashem, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when smiting the Egyptians, but saved our houses. So it uses this sort of dichotomy in the verse between smiting and saving. I think it would maybe apply to a mischievous child or person who maybe learns through, the experimentation, I guess, of figuring out, what is right and wrong through, I guess, doing things. I don't know a whole lot about child development, but maybe that's how some kids learn about things, being right or wrong through experience. I don't know. That's just my thoughts.
Great, thank you. Other thoughts?
It seems to me that the word like the simple one, it's a very straightforward explanation of why we do what we do. There's no challenge to really have to think about it. There's nothing, and I have to disagree with Gabriel. I don't see this as really teaching a lesson to a Jewish child about their behavior. It's about, the Egyptians. It just, I don't know. That's why I said the simple one.
I would say the wise one, because he's curious to ask the question.
Yeah.
To quote one of my wise grandsons last year, in response to this passage, he said, if God's so smart, he's a wise guy in a way, if God's so smart, why did the Jewish people have to paint blood on the doorpost? Didn't God know the difference between the Jewish homes and the Egyptian homes? And he meant this quite seriously, but I said, oh no, he's being mischievous again. But he wasn't being mischievous. He's a very smart kid. And so I have to be careful in not labeling any of my children anything, because this very smart kid asked for him a legitimate question. And it really put me off because I wasn't sure how to answer it. I didn't know enough about the Midrash or commentaries who I'm sure dealt with this issue. So when I use the word, I don't like the word wise necessarily, because somebody can be wise and arrogant and obnoxious and think they know it all and be considered wise and think they have nothing to learn. To me, that's not the most complimentary one of these. And so I thought of my grandchild at that moment and said, he deserves an answer to that question. And I said, you know what? I'll look it up and I'll come back and I'll tell you tomorrow night.
All right, let's go on to our next verse.
What's the answer?
What's the answer? So there are two parts to this exercise. One is putting you in the position of the rabbis who said, okay, we've got these 4 verses, we've got these 4 paradigms, which one goes with which? So you get to play rabbi here. And the rabbis and I'm sure the rabbis had disagreements. And as we'll see, the questions sometimes went with different children depending on which step in the process we're in. And the answers also sometimes went with different children. Let's look at our next verse. Justin, would you read this, please?
Throughout the 7 days, unleavened bread shall be eaten. No leavened bread shall be found with you, and no leaven shall be found in your territory. And you shall explain to your child on that day, it is because what Adonai did for me and what I went from Egypt. Context, this is from the biblical book of Exodus, after the Israelites were freed from slavery and Moses told them to keep the holiday of Passover every year. Which child would you associate with this verse with? Wise, wicked, simple, or doesn't know how to ask?
Wicked.
I would say that this might be for the wise child. Perhaps because the child, in needing to or wanting to acquire knowledge might ask, for like the nature of this, like what exactly is this? And therefore, require an explanation because as you shall explain. So necessitating an explanation, if you ask for something, then an explanation, or if you ask, about something, an explanation is going to follow. So that's sort of why I said the wise.
I mean, it could also be the one who doesn't know how to ask because it just says, we're not going to eat any leavened bread or, have any of that. And you have to explain to your child. So it doesn't, have a kid asking. It's just, you have to explain it to them regardless of if they're going to ask or not.
What about we call the wicked child being contrary in that he loves sandwiches and he loves bread and doesn't want to go a week without eating bread?
I was thinking the same thing because the wicked or mischievous one, how come I can't have?
Yeah.
Let's go to our next text. Carol Koenig, would you read this text, please? Sorry, Carol Fink.
But every firstling donkey you shall redeem with a sheep. If you do not redeem it, you must break its neck. And you must redeem every male firstborn among your children. And when in time to come, a child of yours asks you, saying, what does this mean? You shall reply, it was with a mighty hand that Adonai brought us out of Egypt, the house of bondage. When the Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, Adonai slew every male firstborn in the land of Egypt, the firstborn of both human and beast. Therefore, I sacrifice to Adonai every first male issue of the womb, but redeem every male firstborn among my children. This comes a few verses later, right around the first time that the commandment of tefillin is given. Which child would you associate with this verse? Wise, wicked, simple, or doesn't know how to ask?
I might say this is for the wicked child because he sees that if you don't redeem a donkey, you have to break its neck. You might ask, if you don't redeem a child, does that also apply?
I have a question. Doesn't some of it come from, what does this mean? How is that question asked? Is it asked in an arrogant way, or is it asked in a curious way? I think that can give different implications to how the answer is understood.
Donkeys and male children, the only ones that are redeemed?
Or the only ones that need redeeming?
Yes. First, definitely firstborn male child. That's called Pidyon Haben. And I believe it's the firstborn male animal of any animal in your domesticated flock. So I think sheep probably also fall into this category, and cattle, but I will double check that.
How are they redeemed?
I believe with money to the priest. I will double check that.
First fruits are redeemed through teruma, right?
Yes.
It's different. Anyway.
How do you redeem a donkey with a sheep?
No, you redeem a donkey with money.
Well, it says, but every first donkey you shall redeem with a sheep.
Oh, I see.
So is that like with the lamb's blood, I guess? Is that what that's
No, good question.
referring to?
It's possible that this means that both the sheep and the donkeys get redeemed at the same time. Looking at the context of this verse would probably clear this up. And I'm sorry, I don't have my Chumash in front of me, but if somebody looked up Exodus chapter 13, verse 12, that would probably shed some light on the situation. And if nobody comes up with an answer before the end of class, then I will look it up.
Shall I just read that verse?
Please.
Would that be helpful? I don't know.
That would be. Thank you.
I'll stick to the JPS translation then to keep clarification here. Okay. Okay, can I go back to verse 11 to just give it a little?
Yeah, please, that would be helpful.
I don't promise this will answer it, but I think that's a good question. And when the Lord has brought you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and to your fathers, and has given it to you, you shall set apart for the Lord every first issue of the womb. Every male firstling that your cattle drop shall be the Lord's. That's verse 11, then 12. Oh, no, that's it, 11 and 12. But every firstling ass you shall redeem with the sheep. So that's the distinction of accepting the asses, the chamor, from the or the from the other livestock, or is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that what that's saying is the way that, you redeem your firstborn son was through a sheep. And so that's saying that like you have to redeem all your firstborn livestock as well as your firstborn son with a sheep, with sheep's blood over the door. Is that correct? Or
possibly, or that if you have that based off of the previous two verses, it sounded like you have to redeem your cattle with money, and your firstborn child you redeem with money, but your firstborn donkey you redeem by giving a sheep to the temple instead, or to the priest instead.
Well, in a way, wasn't Isaac redeemed with the ram?
That's true. You could certainly look at it that way.
Would you like to hear Robert Alter's comment?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Okay. Since the donkey was an impure animal for both dietary and ritual purposes, it could not be sacrificed, and a lamb or sheep had to be sacrificed in its stead. As William Propp observes, a donkey was worth several times the value of a sheep, so the sheep substitution would almost certainly be embraced rather than the alternative of destroying the donkey that is put forth in the next clause. The breaking of the neck could conceivably refer to slaughter with a knife at the back of the neck rather than at the front, as is ritually prescribed. The idea is that if a person should refuse to perform the substitute sacrifice for the donkey, he should be deprived of its use, which no sane owner of this ubiquitous and valuable beast of burden and means of transportation would do. So basically, it sounds like they're being put into a position that they absolutely will sacrifice the sheep in place of the donkey because the donkey is just too valuable.
Yes. So what I'm taking from all of this is that your firstborn domesticated animal is brought as a sacrifice to God and given to the priests to eat, which is how they got food because they didn't have their own land. But donkeys are not sacrificable for ritual purposes. And so you bring a sheep instead. And if you don't bring a sheep, then you don't get to use the donkey. So you're going to want to bring the sheep. And children don't get sacrificed. The Bible is very clear about that. So you redeem your child with money.
So is this is where the custom comes from when you have a child and your firstborn is a boy, that you give money and buy him back? Because I know we did that with ours, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
That's called a pedion habeton, and it comes from this.
Okay.
Good. I was just going to ask, so what does that mean for our lives today?
You still do it.
As somebody who has a new firstborn son, so what's the custom?
The custom is that if your firstborn son has survived 30 days, then you find a priest, a descendant of Aaron directly, called a Kohen, and you give the Kohen or Bat Kohen, the daughter of a Kohen, 5 silver coins in exchange for getting to keep your son. Nobody chooses to not keep their child, even when they've been crying a lot and had a particularly stinky diaper. Nonetheless, everybody takes the child back. And then the coins, depending on the custom of the community, sometimes they are given to charity, and sometimes a community has a rotating set of 5 silver coins that anybody who needs it gets to use.
David, our coins today do not contain any silver. But what do we do?
I think these days you use what is called a, quote, silver dollar, or the closest equivalent that you can find, a dollar coin. And if you can't find that, probably $5 would suffice. But I would check with whoever you are using as your halachic authority at that moment, should that be a situation that you're in.
David, this may be slightly off the topic, but it's right here in the context underneath. And this comes a few verses later, right around the first time that the commandment of tefillin is given. So I'm sitting here trying to think of what is the connection between this redemption piece and tefillin. Is there a connection?
I believe the connection has to do with what it says in verse 14 about it was with a mighty hand that God brought us out of Egypt. And so we put our tefillin on our hand with the outstretched arm as a reminder of how God brought us forth with a mighty hand, a yad chazakah.
But we don't put the tefillin on the dominant hand, we put it on the other arm.
Correct. That's because it says in the Haggdah, you should tie them as a sign on your hand. And it is very hard to tie on your dominant hand. So you tie it on your non-dominant hand. And just like we are using our mighty hand to tie our tefillin, God used God's metaphorical mighty hand to bring us out of Egypt. Let's go on to our last verse. Naomi, would you read this, please?
When in time to come your children ask you, what mean the decrees, laws, and rules that our God Adonai has enjoined upon you, you shall say to your children, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and Adonai freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand. Adonai wrought before our eyes marvelous and destructive signs and portents in Egypt against Pharaoh and all his household. Context. This is from the biblical book of Deuteronomy, right after the Shema and the Haggdah. Which child would you associate with this verse? Wise, wicked, simple, doesn't know how to ask.
Thank you.
According to Haggdah, this is the wicked child because he excludes himself from being part of the family, part of the people who are liberated. When he says you, he doesn't say us.
It says our God. No, but I can see where you say that. Enjoy it. Yeah.
May I make a brief mention about that? Because maybe this is the point to say this, that it says enjoined upon you, as I think it was her, or I think it was Charles pointed out. But there's a note in the in the JPS, and also as it happens in my Haggdah, that points out that in the olden days, before the Middle Ages, they had a traditional text for the Haggdah, which is really apparently based on another version that existed, and of the Deuteronomy text, and also in the Septuagint. So the Greek translation follows this. It said, "has enjoined upon us," and that makes it for a different and actually easier text to understand. Joined upon us. It's not about you, it's about us. But the rabbis in the Middle Ages, it says in the Haggdah anyhow, changed that. They were uncomfortable with the variation, I guess, in the Torah text from what they quoted in their Haggdah. So they changed it to be logical, that is to say, to conform to their Torah text, their Masoretic Torah text. But by doing that, they made a real problem for themselves and for us, if I can put it that way, in understanding why these sons are so different from each other. Because if you do it the other way, it was easier to understand. What are these decrees that God has enjoined on us? And then there's no apparent separation or hostility. Sorry for going on so long.
No, this is good and relevant. So if it said, what mean the decrees, laws, and rules that our God Adonai has enjoined upon us, which child would this sound like?
A wise child.
Okay. What if it said, what mean the decree, laws, and rules that our God Adonai has enjoined upon you?
And he's not considering that he has an obligation to do that. But somewhere I recall in the answer it says, but this is an obligation to keep for we all have to consider that we all went out from Egypt. So I don't recall if this is where that's added on in the response to the questions, but let's see, this was ever asking the question, if you say this is the question as it was posed, rather than the source, it's posed in the Bible here to you, so.
Charles, you may be thinking of another part in the Maggid section where it says, "Bechol dor v'dor chayav adam lir'od et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa mitzrayim." In every generation, a person should see themselves as if they came out of Egypt. Mm-hmm. And that text may be based off of this verse where it says, "We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and Adonai freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand."
I was reading it like Cindy, and when it's us, the wise one, I think would look around and say all of us have to follow these decrees. But and it's you, then it's the simple one who would kind of say, "Well, how come you have to do that? I don't have to do it, but you have to do it."
To the earlier point, the child is saying our God. So the child is associating with the community. And you could argue that the child recognizes that these halachot are the responsibility of adults. So you could argue that it's actually an inquiring, not hostile question.
I don't know. I'm just thinking when I think about my children, they're all adults now. And if they could ask me the question.
So, being mindful of the time, I'm going to recap what we've done so far today, and then I'll give some indication of where we're going. We started with the beginning of the section in the Haggdah, where we see that the Haggdah says that the Torah speaks of 4 children, one who is wise, one who is evil, one who is innocent, one who doesn't know how to ask. We also looked at the tune a little bit. We thought about the different types of children, how one could have come up with other 4 types of children, and the rabbis chose these. And then we've looked at the 4 verses. The one from Exodus, what do you mean by this rite? It is the Passover sacrifice to Adonai, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and smiting the Egyptians, but saved our houses. Then next chapter, you shall explain to your child on that day, it is because of what Adonai did for me when I went free from Egypt. A couple verses later in that same chapter, when in time to come a child of yours asks, saying, what does this mean? You shall reply, it was with a mighty hand that Adonai brought us out from Egypt, the house of bondage. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, Adonai slew every male firstborn in the land of Egypt, the firstborn of both human and beast. Therefore I sacrificed to Adonai every first male issue of the womb, but redeem every male firstborn among my children. And finally, this verse from Deuteronomy, when your children ask you, what mean the decrees, laws, and rules that our God Adonai has enjoined upon you, or a different textual variation upon us, you shall say to your children, we are slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and Adonai freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand. Adonai wrought before our eyes marvelous and destructive signs and portents in Egypt against Pharaoh and all his household. We looked at each of these verses, and we thought, which child might this go with? Thinking about the question, thinking about the answer that's given, thinking about the context sometimes. We came up with different possible ways that these verses might be applied. As a foreshadowing, we will see in the artwork that the art can also be interpreted differently in many of the Haggadot as to which child goes with which depiction. And next week, we will see the evolution of this. We will meet the first attempt to describe the 4 children, see which verses go with which child. We'll meet a second attempt a little bit later. And finally, we will see it in the Haggdah and how that's in relationship to those 2 previous attempts, all of which build on these 4 verses. We will then look at a more modern take on this, and we'll look at other resources as we have time.
David?
Yes.
Before we leave, why is it that the Haggdah, from all of the siddurim and scrolls that we use in all our services during the course of the year, why is a Haggdah the only one that's illuminated, and why is a Haggdah always illuminated? Or virtually always, I should say.
I don't know that illuminations were not used in other texts. I believe that Megillot, when they were handwritten before the printing press and families had their own personal copies of them, I believe they may have also been illuminated. And certainly there are illuminations in copies of Bibles. I think Haggadot, more than some of the other texts, reflect the customs of their time. There's a little bit more freedom to add and to discuss at home, probably because it's a home-based holiday. It is not strictly done in the synagogue. So there's more variation in the text. There's more variation in how the text is applied. And therefore, it's been a little less standardized by the printing press. You ask great questions, and I think the fact that Passover is a time of asking questions allows people to feel more comfortable putting their own spin on the text through their artwork. And so I think these are some of the reasons why Haggadot usually have illustrations, although not always, and other texts often have fewer illustrations.
Thank you.
So with that, I'm going to stop our recording.